Hello there! Cristina and Eliezer here with a recapitulation of the contents seen in the first partial of our psycholinguistic course. Our first partial covered the following topics: the biological factors of language, parts of the brain responsible for language, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, problems with the brain and language production, tip of the tongue phenomenon, and the sleeps. To understand the language acquisition process, it is important to review some neurological terms. One of them is lateralization. The lateralization of brain function is a tendency for some neural functions or cognitive processes to be specialized to one side of the brain or the other. The medial longitudinal fissure separates the human brain into two distinct cerebral hemispheres, connected by the corpus callosum.
The two most lateralized functions in the human brain are motor control and language. When a function is lateralized, this often means that one side of the brain exerts more control over this function than the other does. The side that exerts more control is often called the dominant hemisphere for this function. Language is highly localized in the left hemisphere of the brain. In about 90% of right-handed people, language functions are centralized in the left hemisphere. Left-handed and ambidextrous people are somewhat more likely to have language centralized in the right hemisphere, but still, about 70% of them will have language centralized in the left hemisphere. The best example of an established lateralization is that of Broca's and Wernicke's areas, where both are often found exclusively on the left hemisphere. Function lateralization, such as semantics, intonation, accentuation, and prosody, has since been called into question and largely been found to have a neuronal basis in both hemispheres.
One of the primary language areas of the brain is called Broca's area. This name was given after Paul Broca, a French neurosurgeon who discovered that the posterior part of the frontal lobe of the left hemisphere influenced speech disorder after examining a recently deceased patient. Broca's area, located in the left hemisphere, is associated with speech production and articulation. Our ability to articulate ideas as well as use words accurately in spoken and written language has been attributed to this crucial area. Karl Wernicke, a German neurologist, discovered another part of the brain, this one involved in understanding language, in the posterior portion of the left temporal lobe. This critical language area in the posterior superior temporal lobe connects to Broca's area via a neural pathway. Wernicke's area is primarily involved in the comprehension. Historically, this area has been associated with language processing, whether it is written or spoken.
A newly discovered brain region implicated in language is the Geschwin territory. This area connects Broca's and Wernicke's area via a region of the parietal lobe of the cortex and may be important for the acquisition of language in childhood. The angular gyrus allows us to associate multiple types of language-related information, whether auditory, visual, or sensory. It is located in close proximity to other critical brain regions, such as the parietal lobe, which processes tactile sensation, the occipital lobe, which is involved in visual analysis, and the temporal lobe, which processes sounds. The angular gyrus allows us to associate a perceived word with different images, sensations, and ideas. Broca's area processes information received from Wernicke's area into a detailed and coordinated pattern for vocalization, and then projects the pattern via speech articulation area in the insula to the motor cortex. The angular gyrus behind Wernicke's area appears to process information from words that are read in such a way that they can be converted into the auditory forms of the words in Wernicke's area.
When certain areas of the brain related to language are damaged, a phenomenon called aphasia occurs. Aphasia is defined as an impairment of language function due to localized brain damage that leads to difficulty in understanding and/or producing linguistic forms. Someone who is aphasic often has interrelated language disorders, in that difficulties in understanding can lead to difficulties in production, for example.
Broca's aphasia, also called motor aphasia, is characterized by a substantially reduced amount of speech. distorted articulation, and slow, often effortful speech. What is said often consists almost entirely of lexical morphemes, mostly nouns, verbs, and adjectives.
Wernicke's aphasia. Someone suffering from this disorder can actually produce very fluent speech, which is, however, often difficult to understand. Very general terms are used even in response to specific requests for information. Difficulty in finding the correct word, sometimes referred to as anomia, also happens in Wernicke's aphasia.
Then we have conduction aphasia. Individuals suffering from this disorder sometimes mispronounce words, but typically do not have articulation problems. They are fluent but may have disrupted rhythm because of pauses and hesitations. Comprehension of spoken words is normally good.
Slips of the tongue are speech errors in which intended utterances are rearranged between other words or sounds. There are three types of slip of the tongue errors. These types include sound errors, morpheme errors, and word errors. A sound error occurs when the sounds in words close by are exchanged. For example, instead of saying flower pot, one says power flat. A morpheme error occurs when morphemes, which are the smallest meaningful units in language, are switched in words close by. For example, instead of saying self-destruct instruction, one says self-instruct destruction. Word errors occur when actual words are rearranged. For example, instead of saying reading a book to my dog, one says reading a dog to my book. Slips of the tongue can be either conscious or unconscious. According to Sigmund Freud, slips of the tongue reveal the thoughts and desire of the unconscious mind. These slips of the tongue are called Freudian slips or parapraxis.
The connectionist models represent the brain as a network of connected nodes. In 1945, a psychologist named Donald Hebb proposed a theory to explain how neurons in the brain change through experience to encode new information. It's how we learn. In both connectionist models and neuroscience, as you have a thought, clusters of neurons or nodes are activated, meaning they start sending signals to each other. Activation then spreads from higher, more complex clusters to lower ones in patterns that seem unpredictable at first, but after a while, it's not unpredictable at all. Activating certain clusters when you have a thought physically changes the connections between them, making it more likely they'll activate together again. Retrieving the knowledge starts in the highest level clusters, the one containing semantic or meaning information. Then, the activation spreads down to the lowest level clusters containing phonological or sound information. A tip of the tongue state is what happens when the meaning clusters light up, but the sound clusters don't activate completely because the signal in your brain takes a detour instead of following the right path. That's why you often describe characteristics of a word and not the word itself.
Knowing the biological functioning of the brain is essential to understand language acquisition. These contents are what we have reviewed so far in our psycholinguistic course. Thank you very much for watching the video.